So, ladies and gentlemen, the wait for this very important webinar today ends here now. We are in the position of its formal beginning and the commencement of the speech of our most distinguished speakers today. I understand that you all are very eagerly waiting for the speech of our speakers today. So now, we do not waste any time and we would invite the patron chief of this function, Dr. Sri R.K. Anand, Managing Director, CourtKachari.com, to come and inaugurate this historic event and announce its commencement. Welcome, Dr. Sri R.K. Anandji.
Thank you. Namaskar, everybody. A very good evening to everyone joining this webinar from across the world. While thanking all the participants joining this webinar, I shall on behalf of CourtKachari.com would welcome our esteemed chief guest cum main orator, Shri Rajiv Nayyar, senior advocate, and the additional speaker, Ms. Sanam Siddiqui, advocate to this webinar. As you all know, the topic for today's webinar is Right to Life and Personal Liberty. Dear friends, yes, Shri Rajiv Nayyar, senior advocate, needs no introduction. My association with Mr. Rajiv Nayyar goes 40 years ago when he started his legal practice in the year 1978. Rajiv is a very dear personal friend too. Rajiv was appointed as the first standing counsel for the Government of India for the Delhi High Court in the year 1989. He was designated as a senior advocate by the Delhi High Court in the year 1997. He is practicing in all high courts of the country as well as in the Supreme Court. Mr. Nayyar has represented a large number of private corporations, including Vodafone, DLF Limited, Ranbaxy, Star TV, Uber, Alchemist, United Breweries, Videocon Industries. These are the few names. If I start speaking, the list is too large. In 2013, he was bestowed with the doctor's degree in law honoris causa by Amity University, Noida. He has also represented large public sector undertakings, including Reserve Bank of India, ONGC, Indraprastha Gas Limited, BSC, Rajdhani Private Limited, Punjab National Bank in various courts. He was also appointed as special counsel for the Union of India in its disputes with Reliance Industries Limited pertaining to the KG DA6 Basin. He has also previously acted as an arbitrator in an ICC national arbitration between the Ali Bilal Group of General Contracts Limited and Bharat Heavy Electricals Limited. He is also a member of prestigious Delhi International Arbitration Center. Mr. Nayyar owns a big name in the legal fraternity in the country. Now coming to the additional speaker, Ms. Sanam Siddiqui. She is the founder of Parisia Law Chambers. While she belonged to a business family, she always had a passion for legal profession. She is a promising lawyer. She is practicing in the Supreme Court as well as various high court. With this little introduction about the chief guest and the additional speaker, I would now end my speech and declare open today's webinar on the topic, the right to life and personal liberty. I shall now pass over to Mr. Ranjit Kumar to take the proceedings further. Yes, Mr. Ranjit Kumar.
Thank you. Thank you for the welcome speech, Dr. Sri R.K. Anand. Thank you for formally inaugurating the event today. Your guidance is the power of our company, CourtKachari.com. In light of this, we are constantly making new efforts in the field of legal profession as well as legal research and education in India. Be it the matter of constantly modernizing our legal research platform or starting a scholarship program for the meritorious and poor students in the legal education sector, you are relentlessly torching us to go ahead. Now I would like to invite the chief guest of today's function, Shri Rajiv Nayyar, to come and throw light on today's topic with his unique eloquence. Shri Rajiv Nayyar.
Rajiv's, I think, voice is not there. You'll have to unmute.
Thank you, Dr. Anand, Managing Director of CourtKachari.com, for inviting me to this platform. And please don't believe many of the things Dr. Anand said, because he's been a personal friend for 40 years. So he's bound to be very exaggerated about me. But it's a pleasure to be on this platform and speak on the very burning topic today, that is the right to life and personal liberty. And I think this topic will interest everybody in today's context. So, simply put, Article 21 is about the right to life and personal liberty. And actually, it's at the heart of the Constitution, as it guarantees to every individual in a country the right to live and ensure his or her personal liberty, and states that this right cannot be arbitrarily taken away by the state. Over a period of time since independence, this right has assumed wider perspective through various judgments of the honorable courts and events like the emergency in the year 75. Definitely, there are other fundamental rights available to people dwelling in India as guaranteed by the Constitution. But right to life is paramount. As and when life is there, then only speech and expression, movement and dignity of life can be achieved. Of course, there is one other aspect of personal liberty, which is in a criminal justice system, the question of detention and bail. So today's topic on the webinar will try to focus on how this right to life and liberty has evolved over the years. Now, before I touch on the topic, I would just at the beginning give a background on the legislative history of Article 21. Now, Article 21 was actually draft Article 15, which was passed by the Constituent Assembly, and it read that no person shall be deprived of his life or liberty without due process of law. Now, when this article came up before the drafting committee, they suggested two changes. One, the addition of the word personal before the word liberty, and the substitution of the expression except according to procedure established by law instead of without due process of law. The reason given for addition of the word personal before liberty was that otherwise liberty might be construed very widely, so as to include even the freedoms already dealt with in Article 19, Article 13 of the draft. The reason given for this change was clearly right, because draft Article 13, that is today's Article 19, conferred certain freedoms only on citizens, whereas draft Article 15 and now 21 applied to citizens and non-citizens alike. And it was wise to foreclose the argument that the word liberty included the freedoms which had been denied to non-citizens by draft Article 13. Now, the reason given for substitution of expression except according to procedure established by law for the words without due process of law was that the due process of law clause vested courts with a vast power of judicial review and could come in for criticism at the hand of the judges, because who believed that judicial restraint was the need of the day as against judicial activism. Now when we come to Article 21 of the Constitution as it presently stands, Article 21 lays down that no person shall be deprived of his life or personal liberty except according to procedure established by law. And three expressions are very important in Article 21. One, life. Two, personal liberty. And three, procedure established by law. So, Article 21 is not intended to be any constitutional limitation upon the power of the legislature. Its object is actually to serve as a check on the executive so that it may not trample on the personal life or liberty of an individual except under the authority of some law and in conformity with the procedure laid down therein. So it is obvious that before a person is deprived of his life or personal liberty, it is incumbent that the procedure established by law must be strictly followed and must not be departed from to the detriment of the person affected. The words except according to procedure established by law seem to suggest that Article 21 does not apply where a person is detained by a private individual and not by under authority of the state. By the use of the words established by law, it seems our Constitution has accepted the English principle of the supremacy of law in preference to the American doctrine of judicial review of legislation. Therefore, liberty, it seems, according to this view, is a liberty which is confined and controlled by law. And law in this expression means state-made law or enacted law, and not the general principles like the principles of natural justice. Now, the word right to life is also used in Article 21, and that can be interpreted in a widest possible manner. This definition has been expanded and is actually the subject matter of judicial interpretation. And that is how the word life in Article 21 has developed over the years. For instance, in Kharak Singh's case in the year 1962, the Supreme Court held that personal liberty, which is safeguarded by Article 21, is the freedom from a tangible physical restraint and did not therefore include freedom from invasion of privacy or protection of a personal sensitiveness. Justice Subba Rao, speaking for the minority, did not accept the Gopalan thesis that personal liberty was the antithesis of merely physical restraint or coercion. Even the majority implicitly rejected this narrow interpretation of Gopalan, insofar as it came to hold that a domiciliary visit involving an intrusion into a man's home constituted an invasion of personal liberty, even though there was no physical restraint or coercion or interference with his freedom. Justice Subbarao also went beyond the majority view and held that even a secret surveillance of a man's movements interfered with the freedom of his movement, because a man could hardly move freely when all his activities were watched and noted. According to him, and that should be commended even today, personal liberty meant not only absence of physical restraint, but also of psychological restraints. This definition has been expanded in Sunil Batra's case to include the right to live with human dignity. In Sunil Batra's case in 1978 Supreme Court held that the right to life included the right to lead a healthy life so as to enjoy all faculties of the human body in their prime conditions. It would even include the right to protection of a person's tradition, culture, heritage, and the right to live in peace, to sleep in peace, and the right to repose and health. In Vishaka's case, which is a very celebrated case of sexual harassment in a workplace, in the year 1997, the Supreme Court declared that sexual harassment of a working woman at her work as amounting to the violation of rights of gender equality and rights to life and liberty, which is a clear violation of Articles 14 and 15 and 21 of the Constitution. In this landmark judgment, the Supreme Court provided for effective enforcement of basic human rights, of gender equality and guarantee against sexual harassment, and laid down the following guidelines. I'll just read them out to you. They said, first, all employers or persons in charge of workplace, whether in the public or private sector, should take appropriate steps to prevent sexual harassment. Without prejudice to the generality of this obligation, they should take the following steps. Namely, 1, express prohibition of sexual harassment as defined above at the workplace should be notified, published, and circulated in appropriate ways. 2, rules, regulations of government and public sector bodies relating to conduct and discipline should include rules, regulations prohibiting sexual harassment and provide for appropriate penalties in such rules against the offender. 3, as regards private employers, steps should be taken to include the aforesaid prohibitions in the standing orders under the Industrial Employment Standing Orders Act 1946. 4th, appropriate work conditions should be provided in respect of work, leisure, health, and hygiene to further ensure that there is no hostile environment towards women, at workplaces, and no employee woman should have reasonable grounds to believe that she is disadvantaged in connection with her employment. 2, where such conduct amounted to specific offenses under IPC or any other law, under any other law, the employer should initiate appropriate action in accordance with law by making a complaint with the appropriate authority. 3, victims of sexual harassment should have the option to seek transfer of perpetrator or their own transfer. In Bodhisattva Gautam's case in 1995, the Supreme Court held, in the context of rape, that rape is thus not only a crime against the person of a woman, it is a crime against the entire society. It destroys the entire psychology of a woman and pushed her into deep emotional crises. It is only by her sheer will power that she rehabilitates herself in the society, which on coming to know of the rape, looks down upon her in derision and contempt. Rape is therefore the most hated crime. It is a crime against basic human rights and also violative of the victim's most cherished of the fundamental rights, namely the right to live with human dignity contained in Article 21. Now, the Supreme Court, referring to the American case of D.F. Marion in Kiran Bedi's versus Committee of Inquiries case in 1989 Supreme Court, held that good reputation was an element of personal security and was protected by the Constitution equally with the right of enjoyment of life, liberty, and property. The court affirmed that the right to enjoyment of life, liberty, and property, and court also affirmed the right to enjoyment of private reputation was of ancient origin and was necessary to human society. In Chameli Singh's case in 1995, a three-judge bench of the Supreme Court held that the right to shelter is a fundamental right available to every citizen, and it was read into Article 21 of the Constitution of India as encompassing within its ambit the right to shelter to make the right to life more meaningful. In Parmanand Khattar's case in 1989, the Supreme Court has very specifically clarified that preservation of life is of paramount importance. The apex court stated that once life is lost, status quo ante cannot be restored. It was thus held that the professional obligation of all doctors, government or private, to extend medical aid to the injured immediately, to preserve life without legal formalities, to be complied with the police. In Mohini Jain's case, which is of course prior in 1992, occurred when the government of Karnataka issued a notification that permitted private medical colleges in the state of Karnataka to charge exorbitant tuition fees from the government's admitted other than the government seat quota. The Supreme Court observed that mention of life and liberty in Article 21 automatically implies some other rights. Those are necessary for full development of the personality, although they are not enumerated in Part 3 of the Constitution. And they said education is one such factor responsible for overall development of an individual. And therefore, right of education is enshrined and very much part of Article 21 of the Constitution. Now, if we come to the expression personal liberty, and it'll be interesting to see that personal liberty has been interpreted by the Supreme Court in a large number of cases, and the Supreme Court has given a very wide interpretation of the expression life and personal liberty. For instance, in Govind Singh's case versus State of Madhya Pradesh, 1975 Supreme Court, it was conceded by the court that the expression personal liberty included privacy involving freedom from psychological restraints. In Satwant Singh's case, 1967, the right to travel abroad was held to be an aspect of personal liberty of an individual. The Supreme Court held that a passport for travel cannot be denied to a person except according to procedure established by law. In Maneka Gandhi's case, an important right, that is the right of an individual to go abroad, was read in Article 21 as an important aspect of personal liberty. The right to go abroad is not specifically enumerated fundamental right in our constitution, but the Supreme Court expanded provisions of Article 19 and 21 to include this right. In Malkani's case, which is 1972, the Supreme Court held that telephonic conversation of innocent citizens could be protected by courts against wrongful or high-handed interference by tapping of the conversation by the police under Article 21. In Muin's case, the theory propounded by Justice Bhagwati in Maneka Gandhi's case was enlarged. It now was enlarged to include the right of a detainee to have interviews with members of his family and friends, and that was considered as a part and parcel of private personal liberty. Now, Maneka Gandhi's case and Sunil Batra's case, of course, are trendsetters, and this trend has been maintained by the Supreme Court even in subsequent cases. In fact, the post-Maneka Gandhi cases have witnessed an outburst of due process decisions, converting most of Article 21 into a regime of positive rights. For instance, right to life and personal liberty has now been encompassed to include the right to bail, right against solitary confinement, right to humane treatment in prison, right to human dignity, and even the right to get compensation for undergoing torture. So the Supreme Court over the years has innovated the strategy of what is called public interest litigation, enabling public-spirited individuals or groups to move the court to seek redress for the victimized groups. Article 21, of course, still remains the embodiment of procedural due process and has not matured as a limitation against legislative action. Now, after having dealt with life and liberty, it is now important to deal with the other aspect of Article 21, that is procedure established by law. So the expression procedure established by law does not have the same meaning as due process of law as provided in the American Constitution. Now, this due process clause was pressed into service for the first time post our Constitution coming into force in A.K. Gopalan's case. Justice Fazal Ali, in the minority judgment, tried to read the due process concept in Article 21, but the majority judgment authored by Justice Kania held that law in Article 21 is lex and not just, and pleaded that the absence of the word due process in Article 21 precluded the court to go into the reasonableness of the law enacted by a competent legislation. The majority held that, I'm just quoting it, the procedure established by law means procedure prescribed by the law of the state. These words are to be taken to refer to procedure which has a statutory origin, for no procedure is known or can be said to have been established by such vague and uncertain concepts as the immutable and universal principles of natural justice. According to Justice Patanjali Shastri, the process or procedure in this context connotes both the act and manner of proceeding to take away a man's life and personal liberty. The procedure thus established by valid enactment cannot be challenged on the ground of unreasonableness. It has been unequivocally laid down in Gopalan's case that when a personal liberty is restricted or taken away according to the procedure established by law, reasonableness of such restriction would be a different question and has no bearing on the right guaranteed by Article 19(1)(d), read with Clause 5 of the said article. It was further stated that Article 21 affords no protection against competent legislative action in the field of substantive criminal law, for there is no provision for judicial review on the ground of reasonableness or otherwise of such laws. Now, in Ramchandra Prasad versus State of Bihar, followed the meaning of law in Article 21 as given by the majority of the cases in Gopalan's case. In defending the constitutionality of section of the Prevention of Corruption Act, the court stated that the procedure established by law means procedure established by law made by the state, that is to say, by the Union Parliament or legislatures of the state legislatures. And Section 4 of the Prevention of Corruption Act has been enacted by the Parliament, and therefore it must be held that it is a procedure established by law. In K.K. Kachuni's case, it was held that where the state seeks to take away a man's property by a law made under Article 31, he may contend that the law is procedural or substantively unreasonable and hence inconsistent with Article 19. The reason is that the law under Article 31(1) must be a valid law, and the conditions of the validity are twofold. A, legislative virus or competence, and B, non-contravention of any of the fundamental rights guaranteed by Part 3. Therefore, an attempt was made by Justice Subba Rao to agree with the views of Justice Fazal Ali in Gopalan's case. The court's attitude, which was manifest in the earlier years, has shown a marked change in the later years. Now, for instance, the Supreme Court came to recognize the sanctity of personal liberty and held in Maneka Gandhi's case that the principle of hearing, that is the audi alterum rule, could not be wholly excluded where a man's personal liberty is to be affected, and that he must have a reasonable opportunity of being heard, and hearing must be genuine hearing and not an empty formality. In Sunil Batra's case, while dealing with the question as to whether a person awaiting death sentence can be kept in solitary confinement, I must put it in his own words. I'll just reading them. He said, "True, our constitution did not have a due process law or the 8th Amendment, but in this branch of law, after Cooper and Maneka, the consequence is the same. For what is punitively outrageous, scandalizingly unusual or cruel, and rehabilitatively counterproductive is arguably unreasonable and arbitrary, is shot down by Articles 14 and 19, and if inflicted with procedural unfairness, falls foul of Article 21. Justice Desai, in the same case, said as under, the word law in the expression procedure prescribed by law in Article 21 has been interpreted to mean in Maneka Gandhi's case that the law must be right, just, fair, and not arbitrary, fanciful, or oppressive. Otherwise, it would be no procedure at all, and requirement of Article 21 would not be satisfied. In Bachchan Singh's case, the Supreme Court relied on the absence of the American Due Process Clause and the 8th Amendment for upholding death penalty. And Justice Sarkaria, speaking for the bench, said that the courts were not lawmakers and thus could not sit over the wisdom of Parliament, which alone could decide whether or not to retain or abolish death penalty. Chief Justice Chandrachud, as his lordship then was party to the decision both in Bachchan Singh as well as in Sunil Batra. In Bachchan Singh, the court clarified that if Article 21 was understood in accordance with Maneka Gandhi's case, it will read to say, no person shall be deprived of his life or personal liberty except according to fair, just and reasonable procedure established by a valid law. Bachchan Singh reaffirmed that all pervasive omnipresence of reasonableness of Article 14 influenced the interpretation of procedure and not of law. In George Varghese, Justice Krishna Iyer extended the doctrine of due process through Article 21 for giving social justice. I may just read what he said. Equally meaningful is the import of Article 21 of the Constitution in the context of imprisonment for non-payment of debts. The high value of human dignity and worth of human person enshrined in Article 21, read with Articles 14 and 19, obligate the state not to incarcerate except under law, which is fair, just, reasonable in its procedural essence. To be poor in this land of Daritra Narayan, that is the land of poverty, is no crime, and to recover debts by a procedure of putting one in prison is too flagrantly violative of Article 21, unless there is proof of minimal fairness of his willful failure to pay. Justice Bhagwati was a party in A.K. Roy's case, and after this case, he delivered a minority judgment in Bachchan Singh's case, where he said, the word procedure in Article 21 is wide enough to cover the entire process by which deprivation is affected, and that would include not only adjectival but also substantive part of law. Every facet of the law which deprives a person of his life or personal liberty would therefore have to stand the test of reasonableness, fairness, and justness in order to be outside the inhibition of Article 2. According to Justice Bhagwati, therefore, the substantive and procedural portions of law affecting deprivation are so inseparable that both must stand the test of reasonableness, fairness, and justice. He believed that rule of law permits the entire fabric of the Constitution and constituted its entire exercise. And it excluded arbitrariness, and therefore the law must not be arbitrary or irrational and must satisfy the test of reason and democratic form of policy, and that the framers of law are accountable to the people. In Mithu's case, the Supreme Court went even further, where it struck down Section 303 of the Indian Penal Code on the ground that the section not only violated Article 14, but even Article 21. I may read the observation in Mithu's case, where they said, Supreme Court said, that these decisions have expanded the scope of Article 21 in a significant way, and it is now too late in the day to contend that it is for the legislature to prescribe the procedure and for the courts to follow. That is, for the legislature to provide the punishment and for the courts to impose it. Explaining the scope of expansion, which Article 21 has undergone by reason of bank nationalization and Maneka Gandhi's case, the Supreme Court in Mithu's case declared, if a law were to provide that the offense of theft will be punishable with the penalty of cutting off hands, the law will be as bad as violative Article 21. A savage sentence is an anathema to the civilized jurisprudence of Article 21. The court struck down Section 303 of the Indian Penal Code as violative of Articles 14 and 21, insofar as the subjective law of sentence in the section is held to be unreasonable, unjust, and contrary to the text of Article 14. The possibility of all unreasonable, unfair, and unjust laws is thus thrown open by the court, superseding the majority opinion in A.K. Roy's case, where the power to judge the reasonableness of the law itself, in contradiction to the power to decide the reasonableness of procedure established by law, was held to be absent in the Indian Constitution. In Mithu's case, the Supreme Court implied that imposition of death sentence, even under Section 302, would have been held in Bachchan Singh's case invalid and ultra vires of the protection guaranteed by Article 21 if the Parliament had not provided for alternate sentence of life imprisonment and death sentence, but provided only for a mandatory death sentence. A mandatory death sentence would then have to be shot down by the civilized jurisprudence of Article 21. Now, savagery of a death sentence is more an attribute of substantive law. Justice Chinnappa Reddy ascribed the whole of his concurrence to Article 21. Therefore, after Mithu's case, it may not be easy to assert that Article 21 is confined to any longer to procedural protection only. Procedure and substantive law are now overlapping with each other to such a degree that a finding of any law that can completely establish a valid procedure for the enforcement of a savage punishment is impossible. In Deena's case, the Supreme Court upheld the procedure for executing death sentence by hanging a convict by rope. In the majority opinion written by Chief Justice Chandrachud, it observed that a twofold consideration has to be kept in mind in the area of sentencing. Substantively, the sentence has to meet the constitutional prescription contained especially in Articles 14 and 21. Procedurally, the method by which the sentence is required to be law has to be executed, has to meet the mandate of Article 21. Now, I would also like to discuss very briefly on the interrelationship between Articles 11, 19 and 21. Article 21 of our Constitution is very much in the limelight, and its frequent use in the Supreme Court cases fully convinces us that it is probably the key organ in the body of our democracy. If Article 21 is to represent the nervous system, Article 11 plays the role of the heart, representing the circulatory system. And Article 19 represents the senses, with only difference is that whereas human body has 5 senses, Article 19 has 6 senses. Article 20 acts as a defense mechanism. So actually, human fundamental rights embodied in a constitution form a composite body by which a democratic system has survived and is flourishing. In the past, the survival of democracy had become dubious on account of the thinking of the Supreme Court to treat different articles on the fundamental rights without any correlation between them. The question of interrelationship of articles first arose in A.K. Gopalan's case, whereas the leader of undivided Communist Party was detained under the law of preventive detention. The Supreme Court held that Article 22 related to a complete code in preventive detention, and that the validity of an order of detention must be determined strictly according to the terms and within the 4 corners of that article. Article 22 of the Constitution provides that a person can be preventively detained without a charge sheet and a trial. Such a detention may deprive an individual of rights of such freedom to move freely throughout the country, guaranteed under Article 19(1)(d). This freedom can be restricted only on 2 grounds, either in the interest of general public or for the protection of any scheduled tribe as provided under Article 19(5). But the Supreme Court ruled that Articles 19 and 22 were exclusive to each other, and an act of preventive detention should be judged on the basis of the form and object of the state action and not on the basis of its impact on the various fundamental rights of the detainee. Therefore, a law of preventive detention did not have to satisfy the requirements of Articles 14, 19, and 21, so long as the law of preventive detention satisfied the test of Article 22. This view proceeded on the assumption that certain articles in the Constitution exclusively deal with specific matters, and where the requirements of an article dealing with a particular matter in question are satisfied, there is no infringement of the fundamental rights guaranteed by that article, and no recourse can be had to a fundamental right conferred by any other article. But I would now like to say that Supreme Court has laid down a number of propositions, number of judgments to make Article 21 more meaningful than what it was before. I want to summarize the findings and the observations of the Supreme Court under the following heads. First, the court has reiterated that Articles 14 and 19 and 21 are not mutually exclusive. This means that a law prescribing a procedure for depriving a person of personal liberty has to meet the requirements of Article 19. The procedure established by law in Article 21 must also answer the requirement of fairness as provided in Article 14. 2. Expression personal liberty in Article 21 has been given an expansive meaning. The court has emphasized that the expression personal liberty is the widest amplitude, covering a variety of rights which go to constitute the personal liberty of man. And some of these attributes have been raised to the status of some distinct fundamental rights and given additional protection under Article 19. Now, this expression should thus not be read in a narrow and restricted sense, so as to exclude those attributes of personal liberty which was specifically dealt with in Article 19. Attempt of the court should be to expand the reach of the fundamental rights rather than accentuate their meaning and content by process of judicial construction. The right to travel abroad therefore falls under Article 21. Thus, no person can be deprived of his right to go abroad except according to the procedure established by law. The court has given new expression to the expression procedure established by law in Article 21. To deprive a person of personal liberty, Article 21 is no longer means that law could prescribe some semblance of procedure, however arbitrary or fanciful. Now it would now mean that procedure must satisfy certain requisites in the sense of being fair and reasonable. Procedure cannot be arbitrary, unfair, or unreasonable. Concept of reasonableness can be projected in the procedure contemplated by Article 21. The court now has the power to judge the fairness and justness of procedure established by law to deprive a person of his personal liberty. Therefore, it can be said that Menaka Gandhi's case has brought the fundamental right of personal liberty into prominence and thus has paved its way for further expansion over in the future. I am very, very grateful to all of you who have suffered me these 40 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, sir. The more you are praised for your unique and unmatched speech, the lesser it will be. It seemed that you keep up speaking and we will keep increasing our store of knowledge. I hope your today's speech will be remembered for a long, long time. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to invite the second speaker of today, Sanam Siddiqui. Sanam Siddiqui ji.
Thank you for inviting me on this platform. I'm especially honored that I get to share it with such a distinguished lawyer and speaker. So thank you for that. That's a personal happiness for me. So coming to the topic, Article 21 is a topic that I'm very close to. I believe in it very strongly because it promises the right of life and personal liberty to everyone, to any person and every person. And courts have interpreted life to mean and to always mean dignified life. In fact, recently, and one of the Honorable Supreme Court benches has ordered the installation of CCTV cameras across all police stations and offices where there are probe agencies. These cameras, the reasoning being that these cameras to a large extent can oversee abuse and torture. It's unfortunate that the court had to reiterate its earlier order of 2018. However, it has again reiterated that it's imperative to have these kind of CCTV cameras to make sure that there is audio and video footage around the clock. So this order is one of the judicial vigilance against custodial torture, which has been a topic that's been in debate quite recently. In fact, Lord Denning had said in his first Hamlin lecture, whenever one of the king's judges takes his seat, there is one application which by long tradition has priority over all others. The council has but to say, my lord, I have an application which concerns the liberty of the subject. And immediately the judge will put all other matters aside and hear it. To me, the Honorable Supreme Court has definitely upheld this, that there may have been cases which have not been taken up is not any reason not to applaud the recent Supreme Court judgment against illegal arrest. It was made for an offense that allegedly investigation was closed into the offense more than 2 years ago. A closure report was accepted by the court, which is now being sought to be reopened at the instance of the state government. This Supreme Court judgment, however, contains a review of all bail and quashing matters because the judges felt the need to restate the law. And it appears that if this judgment is followed, it seems that there will be sweeping changes on how bail matters are being heard in the country. It appears from the judgment that the Bombay High Court did not even evaluate the FIR. It just wrote a long order denying the bail. The High Court has now been asked to take a final view when the proceedings are listed before it. But the Honorable Supreme Court stated, we are clearly of the view that in failing to even make a prima facie evaluation of the FIR, the High Court abdicated its constitutional duty and function as a protector of liberty. It went on to say that courts must be alive to the need to safeguard the public interest in ensuring that the due enforcement of criminal law is not obstructed. The fair investigation of crime is an aid to it. So then it goes on to say that it's our earnest hope that our courts will exhibit acute awareness to the need to expand the footprint of liberty and use our approach as a decision-making yardstick for future cases involving the grant of bail. So it has been the duty of law enforcement agencies to uphold the majesty of the law and not to unleash the fury of the law. And that is what the Honorable Court has done in this case. It has definitely upheld the majesty of the law because this is a landmark judgment for personal liberty with, like I said, sweeping directions on bail and quashing matters. In fact, it tells us how personal liberty, how one should protect and safeguard personal liberty. Now, recently, there's an ordinance being brought by the UP government about the so far unverified theories regarding love jihad. This ordinance treats every religious conversion as unlawful unless certified by the state. And it also seeks to criminalize religious conversions done for the sake of marriage. What's interesting is that violation of this provision is punishable with imprisonment for a term which can last up to 1 year, which can last for a minimum of 1 year and may extend to up to 5 years, and a minimum fine of 15,000 rupees. If the person who's converted happens to be a woman, the punishment is double the normal term as well as the fine. Now, this ordinance comes just a few days after an Allahabad High Court judgment stating that the right to live with a person of your choice, irrespective of religion, is intrinsic to right to life and personal liberty. So we can see that over the years, the courts have expanded and given a more and more expansive meaning to life and personal liberty under Article 21. In this case, in fact, the Allahabad High Court Division Bench declared that it was bad law. The single judgment, in fact, had stated that conversion just for the sake of marriage was invalid. The division bench said that the single judge's decision failed to deal with the issue of life and liberty of two mature individuals in choosing a partner or the right to freedom of choice as to whom they want to live with. Like I said, the honorable courts, especially the honorable Supreme Court, has given an expansive meaning to personal liberty over the years. In the Shafeen Jahan case, for example, the Supreme Court had stated that the right to change a faith is part of your fundamental right of choice. I can choose what faith I want to profess. In fact, the apex court had also observed that the consent of the family or the community or the clan is not necessary once two adult individuals agree to enter into wedlock. So the court had issued directions to curb khap panchayats in this case, which were interfering in marriages. To show how expansive the definition keeps getting, is another example is the Honorable Orissa High Court's recent advocacy of acknowledging that the right to be forgotten should also be another facet of Article 21. So overall, the courts have shown us how personal liberty should be upheld, and they have continuously stated that personal liberty encompasses a dignified life, not just a life. So what is actually of concern today is that there are certain, senior citizens who are languishing in jails, who are not able to get even the basic amenities today. Stan Swami, for example, is somebody who suffers from Parkinson's. He had requested for a straw and a sipper to drink water, which request was denied. Vara Rao's health has been also deteriorating over the last few months. In fact, despite the pandemic, most of the prisons have still got an average occupancy rate of 126%, which is definitely not keeping in mind social distancing norms. And we definitely know of at least 2 people and a total of 6 prisoners that have died in prisons due to coronavirus. Not much else is known. Therefore, since already I think most things have been said about personal liberty, I would just like to end with one quote. Nightfall does not come at once, nor does oppression. In both instances, there is twilight when everything remains seemingly unchanged. It is in such a twilight that we must all be aware of change in the air, however slight, lest we become unwitting victims of the darkness. The Honorable Supreme Court recently has paved the way to show us how to uphold life and liberty. It is now for the rest of us to follow. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much for impressive speech, Sanamji.
Thank you.
You are known for your outspokenness and for something different. And here you have again proven it. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, now our session of speech has come to its end. And now we switch over to the question and answer session from here.
Raji, I have a question. May I go ahead?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Rajiv sir. Thank you, Sanam ma'am. Sanam ma'am beautifully concluded the speech. Sir, that was just a plethora of knowledge that you shared with us, and we've got insight into a lot of judgments which are related to Article 21. So, sir, my question from you is that, clearly the writ of habeas corpus serves as an important tool in enforcing Article 21. But does the writ of habeas corpus simply examine the power and authority of the authorities to detain the person, or does it review the correctness of the authorities' conclusion of detaining an individual as well? I hope I was clear with my question.
Yes.
Rajiv, you have to unmute.
You are very clear, Vikas.
Thank
So
you.
answer to this question is yes. So a writ of habeas corpus is actually the most important writ for personal liberty. Actually, if we see the definition of the word habeas corpus, it says, let us have the body. So a person who, when he is arrested, he can move the court and for the issuance of a writ of habeas corpus, and then the court will direct the detaining authority or the arresting authority to produce the person before the court, and then will decide, the court will then decide whether the continued detention of that person is lawful or correct, or the detention is illegal and incorrect. So if the detention is unauthorized and illegal, then the court will direct that person's release. So actually the principle of habeas corpus means that a person can be released from unlawful detention. And since the object of the writ of habeas corpus is remedial and not punishable, the legality of the detention has to be decided by the court as on the date of which the application was made. Sunil Batra's case, as I explained to you earlier, has explained this and said that it is not only for release, but the writ of habeas corpus also extends to any relief against any illegal treatment and unlawful discrimination.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
May I ask another question to Rajiv ji?
Anji.
Rajiv ji, first of all, I must thank you for sharing such a vast knowledge on the Article 21, and we are really enlightened, and we have come to know the intricacies of the Article 21, which we will definitely use it in our day-to-day life. Sir, my question is, Article 21 actually confers on a person the right to live a dignified life. Does it also confer a right not to live or right to die if a person chooses to end his life? A person who is suffering from coma, his family is suffering. A person who is suffering from a deadly disease, he knows his life has to end, except that he has to spend his life in the hospital, in like a dead body.
Unfortunately, that is
Can
not
he
the
right to die
position.
also?
That is not the position of law in our court, because Article 21 is only a right to life and certainly will not encompass the right to die. Unfortunately, this is a failing in our system, but unfortunately, that is the position of law. A right to life is only a right of protection, but does not include a right to die or suicide. And you know, this is, you are right, because this is a very important aspect. Because supposing somebody is suffering from terminal cancer, person has no recourse of getting okay, person is on a ventilator for years, I think the family must have the right to pull the plug. Because not only is it misery for the patient concerned, but it's also misery for everybody around. But I hope with the years to come, it will improve.
Right. Sir, a clue from our Bollywood movie. Many a times we see in the Bollywood movies that, somebody has not committed a crime, but actually was accused of it and then got penalized. So now, extrapolating it to a death penalty. So do you think a death penalty, due to its very irretrievable nature, comes in direct conflict with Article 21?
No, the answer is no, not at all actually.
Okay.
Because death penalty is a legal punishment in India. And when Article 21 uses the expression that no person shall be deprived of his life or personal liberty, except according to a procedure established by law. So procedure established by law includes a death penalty, because the Indian Penal Code prescribes that there is a death penalty. And in Jagmohan's case, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Supreme Court said that death penalty is not violative of Articles 14, 19, and 21. They said it is left to the judge concerned to make the choice whether on the facts of the case is so heinous that whether death penalty was warranted or whether it could turn into life imprisonment. But since today life imprisonment has actually become life, so I don't know which is a worse form of punishment, life or death. Because I mean, there are two schools. Somebody says undergoing life imprisonment for the rest of a person's life is far worse, because death penalty is a simple end for what he has done.
I have another question on the under trials. You know, the trauma of the under trials. Under trial detention is a matter of great concern. As per the Amnesty International report, there are 2.81 lakh individuals in Indian jails awaiting trial, and in various cases, people have actually spent more time in jail than the punishment they had to undergo. So, which makes one feel that aspects of Article 21 are there just in letter and not in spirit. Do you think there are remedies to it which can be worked out? Any low-hanging fruits?
See, what has happened? The answer to this is twofold. One is that the court itself, from time to time, is passing lots of orders insofar as release for under trials is concerned. For instance, lesser offenses. Even in the recent COVID times, we've seen that courts have been very liberal in granting relief to under trials. But the difficulty is that until this is backed by amendments in the applicable laws, it can't be implemented. Because, you know, we should be clear, number of judges is less, number of pendency of criminal cases is large. We must be also conscious of the fact that in some cases, a person is so poor that he's not even able to afford to go out on a bond or a bail, and he serves most of his sentence in jail. So he can't furnish, some poor people can't furnish surety. So we have to devise a system whereby we are able to, maybe get amendments in the CRPC so that poor people can be released on furnishing personal bonds or something like that, or make some amendments, because otherwise, by the time a case is brought to trial, most people have very well served their sentence. I must tell you that there's been some committees, like for instance, there's been a letter sent by the Director General of Prisons to the in 2014, saying that there must be some reforms, but nothing so has come forward.
Sir, Swapnil, hello.
Okay. Rajiv,
Sir, I am
carry on.
Sir, my question is that how the natural justice is play a very important role in personal liberty and protection of life, sir.
See, natural justice is a very important aspect because it inspires the principle that no person can be deprived without due procedure. So natural justice means, supposing, for instance, a person is being blacklisted. I mean, somebody's business is coming to an end. So Supreme Court and the courts have laid down a principle that first you must hear the person concerned. You must hear his version before condemning him. If there is no natural justice, then a state authority can just impose a blacklisting. It can impose a ban, cutting short a person's business. So, of course, the principle of natural justice has expanded, expanded and contracted over the years. Because recently some courts have, the Supreme Court has held that unless prejudice is caused, then there's no reason to hear a person concerned. But ultimately, natural justice is a very important aspect, because the principle is that no man should be condemned unheard.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Sir, one very burning and one very contemporary topic. We see that nowadays media's whatever news we see on the television, you can put it as an equivalent to whatever soaps that we see on our TV serials. Now, common person is very disgusted by the fact, and even a lay person understands that the way media starts trying a person who's not even an accused in their 8 p.m. shows, it has become very disgusting for the common people. So how do you see this infringement of privacy from the media people? Is it not a violation of Article 21? Because in my opinion, or probably in layman's opinion, it is very disturbing, and it feels as if it's an infringement in our lives. Isn't there a need of a regulation, right?
You are absolutely right that trial by the media actually infringes upon the right under Article 21. But the problem is that we are dealing with two competing rights. One is the right to personal liberty of the person and the right of press, freedom of the press, which is guaranteed under Article 19. But what has happened is that over the years, I don't want to name media houses, but over the years, some media houses have taken undue advantage of the freedom of the press and have virtually condemning, they have become like self-proclaimed judges. For instance, you see two recent cases. The damning of Shashi Tharoor's wife's trial, he was completely tried by the media. And the case of Riya Chakravarti. So actually in the case of Riya Chakravarti, it's a case of complete judicial travesty, because a case was registered against her because of the constant prompting of a TV channel. Now and when the court granted her bail, they came with a conclusion there is nothing at all case made out of even her against her prima facie. So there are press guidelines, there are media guidelines, there's self-imposed censorship norms in place for the media. But unless it comes from within, it's very difficult. But you are right that the media is more often than enough trampling on the rights of individual, which is guaranteed under Article 21.
No scope of judicial activism.
So, judicial activism, there are lots of cases. I'm doing, for instance, a case where the entire body of producers and film actors and actresses of the Bollywood have filed cases against media channels saying that please stop this vilification on TV platforms. Court has protected, but eventually the question is, see, what will the court say? Court will say don't defame. But what is defamation is very difficult to interpret.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to expand, to envisage. A person may say, no, I'm calling you a thief, but it's all right. I think you ought to have been called a thief. So it's a very difficult thing. But I must just tell you, I must just read one extract from a decision where it says, tarnishing the reputation of a person by the police on the basis on its own investigation amounts to prejudging the correctness of the allegations, which is unknown to Indian law, and a person is presumed to be innocent unless and until he is convicted. So unless the newspaper or the TV channels come sort of protect, have a self-imposed, parameters, very difficult to enforce.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you.
Sir, I have a very interesting question on the wrong accusation. People are being falsely implicated or wrongly implicated in various cases. You must have seen. So my question is, can the judiciary prescribe compensation in terms of remedy to a person who is wrongly accused in the matter relating to infringement of his rights guaranteed under the Article 21?
So actually, it's a very interesting question, because now Article 21 has been expanded to include prescribing compensation. For instance, there was a case in Assam of Madhubala Mondal, where a person spent several years in jail without being declared guilty. And if I'm not mistaken, was detained for 3 years because of some mistaken identity of the Assam police. So Supreme Court actually granted, passed a censure, and Supreme Court last year granted 50 lakhs compensation in the case of a former ISRO scientist who was detained illegally on the ground of some spy racket. Although this compensation was ordered 24 years after he was convicted, but this actually has laid the path for a statutory recognition of the right to compensation in cases of wrongful arrest and imprisonment.
That's right.
My lord, if I am permitted, I have one question in this matter.
Yeah, please go. Brief question.
I think this question Ms. Siddiqui will answer, because she is
Respectable sir.
I'm here. Yes.
Respectable sir, since you have replied the question, I have one query and I have one question. Why not a law should be laid down punishing the person who are involved in a wrongful detention or arrest?
Sanamji, will you take up this question?
What's in front of sir? I mean,
Yes, please. Sanam, please.
would you repeat the question, please?
My question, with regard to the previous question, which was answered by my honorable sir, I think why not to have a punishments for who are involved in a wrongful confinement, which is the violation of the Article 21 of the Constitution. That is the personal liberty of a person.
I mean, in India, so far, we have certain times given compensation for wrongful persons who have been wrongfully detained or arrested. Is that what you mean by confined?
Yes.
So yes, we don't, they can prescribe compensation, but it hasn't been taken up really as such. So for example, the Assam's Madhubala Mondal case, it was a bunch of unlawful arrests and detention where individuals had to spend certain years in jail without being guilty, and they were later on stated that it was a case of mistaken identity. So definitely, yes, you're right in the sense that there needs to be some sort of accountability in our criminal justice system. However, the courts have been slow to give compensation. Although there are recent judgments that acknowledge that individuals that have been framed or falsely accused can prosecute but however, most of those judgments relate to the National Security Act or terror charges. So there is no hard and fast rule. Therefore, the Supreme Court has definitely recognized that granting of compensation is necessary. However, it is for wrongful incarceration and arrest. Last year, for example, the ISRO case, that was the most famous one when it comes to wrongful arrest compensation. 50 lakhs was granted to the ISRO scientist because he was detained for allegedly leaking official secrets. However, this compensation was given to him 24 years after. So it does again, bring up the question of whether that compensation was actually truly a compensation. So yes, I think there needs to be a lot more of, there needs to be certain amendments to make sure that yes, and there needs to be some sort of judicial activism, I suppose, to make sure that people are not, spending years illegally jailed. But this is not just a problem in India. This is a global issue.
No. My question with regard to a person who are directly involved in the wrongful detention, which has been declared later on that he was the illegal detention by the police or any other mechanism or authorities of the state government.
Well, I think
with regard to making out a law so that such things cannot be repeated.
I agree with you to a certain extent, I would say, except I think a lot of for example, who would you
I
go
did
after?
not come across with any case laws in which
There necessarily might not be because, and I suppose that, sir is a much better judge to answer the question. In my opinion, it's in that because, like, for this example, right, the ISRO scientist one, now 24 years after his illegal detainment, he's being compensated. Who are you going to go after? The person who incarcerated him, or the person who is illegally detained him might not be there anymore. So maybe the fact that it takes so many years may be one of the deterrent factors in not being able to put some sort of accountability or responsibility on the persons who have done it.
Just to add, you are
Yes.
absolutely right. There's no point holding a person accountable after 24 years.
Correct.
So, a man is put in jail or a man is incarcerated illegally, then the remedy must be immediate. You are absolutely right. But unfortunately, our system is so slow that
that's why since
you are absolutely right. The system is so slow that it takes a great deal of time before accountability can be fastened on some person. And compensation alone may not be enough because if a man is put in prison for 24 years, what is the compensation of few lakhs? He's lost his better part. For instance, please look at that gentleman who is in jail. He's asking for a sipper and he was denied a sipper. He's 80 years old. And if it is ultimately found that he is to be released on bail, what is to be done for all this time that he was there?
In this case matter, he has lost 24 years of his life and liberty.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. So in
And
this,
50 lakhs is not going to bring those 24 years back.
Under the circumstances, the person who must be accountable for this violation of this article must be punished, and there must be a law.
Sir, we'll have to cut
punishing
the answer session.
You see, just to add, this is a very vexed question. Just as you are saying in criminal law, there must be a accountability principle.
Yes,
even in civil law, for instance, a man is illegally taken to court, and then after 20 years, if the case is only dismissed with some cost, is not enough. So this is it's a gray area. I'm sure legislation must come.
That's right.
Imposing exemplary damages in civil cases. But in criminal cases, damages alone will not help. Maybe some sort of further procedure will have to be laid down.
Thank you.
Because this is misuse of.
You are absolutely right. Misuse of.
Thank you very much.
May I have one question? May I ask with the honorable judges, sir?
Sir, sorry, because now it is 5:30, and as per we are bound to close by 5:30.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, and so we would have had it more had it not been, so close to 5:30, the time of closing the program. So we have had such a beautiful interactive session in question and answer session.
Great.
And ladies and gentlemen, so we have entered into the last leg of our program today, and that is the session of vote of thanks. First of all, I would like to propose hearty vote of thanks to our chief guest, Sri Rajiv Nayarji, for gracing today's seminar and delivering the main and very significant address. Thank you, sir, for a very interesting and thought-provoking speech.
Thank you
Thanks a
for
lot.
having me. Thank you for having me.
It is indeed very kind of our chief guest to have accepted this invitation in spite of his various engagements. Led mammoth address today, he has highlighted origin and separate aspects of Article 21 and has provided much intellectual food for thought to all of us. I am sure his learned and excellent address will set a tone in the different sections of judicial practice. Sir, I am sure that all the participants have taken note of your deliberation and suggestions and will be discussing within their domain. With these words, I would like to thank our distinguished additional speaker, Ms. Sanam Siddiqui ji, for making excellent presentation and making this seminar interesting and meaningful. I'd also like to thank our Managing Director, Dr. Sri R.K. Anand ji, for his incredible contributions and guidance. Without his constructive support and inspiration, this webinar would have been far from being successful. I must thank Sri Vikas Anand ji, Srimati Sonali Anand ji for their constructive and continued support. All the staff of our company courtkachari.com deserve congratulations for the success of this webinar. Each of them has contributed in one way or other for the success of this webinar. Let me thank the delegates and all the participants
Thanks a lot, sir.
so well to our invitation to participate in this webinar today. Let me thank you all for associating with the seminar by your presence this evening. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Rajiv.
you.
Thank you.
sir.
Thanks a lot, sir.